CBC News, Panama City.
John Murray, CBC News, Moscow. Claude Adams, CBC News in Eastern Saudi Arabia.
For the Journal in Eastern Saudi Arabia, I'm Brian Stewart.
Martin C. Mungle, CBC News, Doha, Qatar.
Patrick Brown, CBC News, Amman.
The CBC Foreign Correspondents Forum 1991 with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening and welcome to Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto. Tonight, an opportunity for the public to question the correspondents, our correspondents, the men and women who cover the world for CBC television. These are rapidly changing times on the international stage. Two current examples, of course, the aftermath of the Gulf War and the ever-changing developments in a rapidly changing Soviet Union. Tonight, those and other issues, as our viewers ask us about the stories that we have covered and the way we have covered them. So let us begin with the first question from microphone 1.
My question is for Mr. Don Murray, the Moscow correspondent. As your coverage of recent events in the Soviet Union indicates, there seems to be the emergence of two strong visions within the USSR, the Gorbachev-backed push for a strong central government versus the Republican push for rapid decentralization and greater autonomy. I'm just wondering, as we see Gorbachev intensify his position in terms of banning protests and banning strikes, and at the same time we see coal miners out striking, and today news that the telephone operators in the Republic of Kiev have gone on strike. What is your vision or prediction in terms of what the feeling is within the Soviet Union? Is there a sense that some sort of peaceful dismantling of the Soviet Empire, in quotes, is possible, or are we on the verge of civil war in the USSR?
10 seconds, Don.
Should I rephrase that?
I'll try to be brief. I think that you can be misled by Mr. Gorbachev and his actions. He has accumulated on paper an enormous amount of power. He announces that he's going to ban strikes and ban demonstrations, and then actually doesn't get quite around to doing it. Many people don't take him terribly seriously in the Soviet Union at this point, perhaps to their peril, because he does have the army behind him pushing. I would say that at the moment, the running is in favor of those who are decentralizing, and certainly it's in favor of people around Mr. Yeltsin, who is in favor of that type of decentralization. I think that while Mr. Gorbachev has the backing of the apparatus behind him, the apparatus of the army and the KGB, he faces a situation now with an ongoing miners' strike that he daren't intervene bloodily to try and put these people back to work. We've been told not to make predictions, but I'll break that rule tonight, and I'm not sure that you're going to see Mr. Gorbachev around, perhaps this time next year, but in 2 years I'm not sure you're going to see him around. I think that there's just too much of an erosion of power, and I will say one more thing. The Russians, and Mr. Gorbachev himself leads in this, like to talk of the possibility of civil war. If I had a ruble, and goodness knows they're not worth a hell of a lot anymore, but if I had a ruble for every prediction of blood in the streets in February that I got 6 months ago, I'd still be a millionaire, and there was no blood in the streets in Moscow I'm talking about. So I'm not sure that despite all the talk you're going to see that.
Microphone number 2.
My question has to do with investigative journalism within the war, or about the Gulf War. All too often I felt the news was like a press release published by the White House or by the House of Commons, that you were just reporting on the action as it was going on. And there was that investigative dimension missing for me, and I know that you were operating under certain constraints that the army and the military within the Middle East were imposing upon you. But I guess my question is, why is Kurdistan such a surprise? Why wasn't that kind of stuff spoken about during the days leading up to the war? Why were there not sort of deeper analysis of what was going on in the Middle East and of the potential of a war there?
All right. Brian Stewart, who works for the Journal and spent a good deal of time not only during the war but before the war analyzing some of the very points that you're bringing up. Brian.
It's curious that in previous years of these seminars, the media is often accused of going overboard on bang bang and emphasizing combat footage over everything else. This was a war in which, if anything, we emphasized analysis over analysis over analysis. Some people say we had a Niagara Falls of experts pouring across the street night after night after night. So we either get it because we have too much bang bang, or in this case, because of the pools, we weren't allowed to get anywhere near the bang bang. But the fact of the matter is, a huge number of experts kept telling us over and over on the Journal and on the National and across the American networks for months before the war that it would be a bloody war, that the conservatives were estimating, the optimists were estimating 1,000 dead, and the pessimists were estimating up to 20,000 dead. There was a lot of coverage as to the likely outcome of the war in terms of hardship. If anything, that aspect was exaggerated. Now, I think your earlier point is, why wasn't it caught up that the Kurdistan situation? And I think you're right there. I think that was overlooked, but not so much by the media, but by the intelligence services. I honestly do believe that the coalition was flabbergasted by the speed and extent of the rebellion there. There was prediction there would be trouble there. You'll remember as far back as October, General Schwarzkopf was quoted as warning that Iraq was defeated too badly, could be Lebanized, that Iraq could become a vacuum of power. There was discussion of this. I think what happened is what's happening in our business for 2 years now. We keep going to experts. Experts don't predict Eastern Europe's going to collapse. Experts don't predict, Meech Lake's going to collapse. The experts are wrong more times, I'm afraid, than we give credit to. We should, I think, be a little more careful.
Or simply you don't judge this as something that's newsworthy for the Canadian public?
I think we judge it very much as a newsworthy item for the Canadian public. But, and it's quite true that it's very difficult to get in to do those stories. And I suspect that if we had the opportunity and were able to get in to do them, we would try, and we will try. But we cover the Intifada because it is also
CBC has demonstrated a commitment to fair journalism, and of course it's an important story.
Microphone number 2.
Yes, my question is really directed at Paul Workman. Paul, do you think now that the world has liberated Kuwait, that we will lose the will to liberate the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Lebanon? Do you think that once again the Palestinians will have their hopes for a homeland and their right to a homeland dashed? What's your opinion about that?
Well, I, like you, can only hope that the will be increased to find a settlement of the Palestinian issue as a result of the war. If anything good will come out of a war, perhaps that's one of the things, one of the good things. It seems, from what I'm seeing, and I've been back in Canada for a couple of months now, from what I'm seeing, there seems to be a new will, a new sense of urgency, a new sense of a new movement to somehow settle the Palestinian question. And it's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be a very long and arduous, difficult, complex, messy process. But maybe we're seeing now the beginnings of a settlement of this very painful issue for more than 1 million people.
Paul, are you the only correspondent in the Middle East?
For the CBC?
Yes.
Yes.
You see, I wanted to make the point that I would like, I know that the CBC is economizing or trying to these days, but I would like to see correspondents covering Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Iran. I would like the news from their perspective, from their point of view. I would like complete, fair, balanced coverage.
All right.
And I would like the truth.
I want Anna Maria Tremonti to come in on your original point as well. Anna Maria has helped out our coverage in the Middle East, filling in for Paul at times. Also in the past year, she's worked in Moscow. She covered Panama, the Panama War 18 months ago. And she's also covered the end of Margaret Thatcher and the beginning of John Major. So her responses on all these questions are more than interesting, and especially on this one for her time covering the Middle East. Anna Maria?
I think your concern about other nations forgetting about an Arab-Israeli peace, I think, in fact, this has raised the concerns and raised the urgency once more with the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we see, in fact, Mr. Baker is planning another visit to Israel to continue the dialogue on Middle East peace. We saw the Israeli government talking last week about its willingness to have some sort of talk. So I don't think it's going to fall to the wayside. I think that what you're going to see is a number of nations pushing to try to get some sort of peace and pushing harder than they might have before the entire Gulf crisis started.
Microphone number 1.
I would like to direct my question at Mr. Terry Malewski. I should ask what's finally Mr. Bush and his administration is going to do about a UN enclave for the Kurds. And in my opinion, and perhaps that could be a fact of life too, that what's happening to the Kurds now is one of the most tremendous catastrophes in the modern times. It's just a great tragedy just to sit and watch these people perish in great numbers.
I think the word is realpolitik. In the case of the Bush administration, it means that you're dealing with an extremely conservative administration which would rather the devil it knows than the devil it does not know, and therefore is prepared to countenance a continuation of Saddam Hussein in power without actually saying so in public in a press release, in order that Iraq may remain as an integral nation. In other words, that it isn't Lebanized. That's the underpinning of the administration's policy towards the Kurds. It was before the war. Remember that the Kurds, if you want to look at it that way, have been sold out by the Western powers before. I won't go into the history, but you're probably familiar with it. And that to answer directly, what are they doing? They will be serious, not just the Americans, but in concert with the British and other powers, including Canada, will be serious about a UN enclave
or a sanctuary or a safe haven or whatever word they find for that, for the Kurds, that doesn't go as far as giving them a nation, Kurdistan. They will be serious about that, but if you're asking me, because I'm in Washington, about the Bush administration, which of course will be the leading player in this, they will be serious about it because they have to, not because they wanted to. They did not want to ruin Iraq to the point that they would have another Lebanon in their hands. They didn't want to see a Shiite regime. They don't want to see an independent Kurdistan because it would upset Turkey. President Ozal is now a good friend of President Bush as a result of the Gulf War. And we could go on about it, how cruel the world is. But you asked for a straight answer. The straight answer is that they care so much, but they don't care that much. They will be serious about an enclave, but not about an independent Kurdistan.
Microphone number 2.
While Eastern Europe is moving towards democracy, we still see in the Arab world one-party dictatorships and feudal monarchies. I wonder if someone on the panel could comment on why there is not the same movement towards democracy in the Arab world, and what the implications are for that lack of democracy for the peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Who on the panel would... Brian Stewart is, and then Patrick. Brian?
Well, you could certainly extend that question a good deal further. Why in much of Africa is that the same problem? We're not seeing a democratic process fully taking flight, but we are seeing a lot of stirrings in northern Africa, for instance, in Algeria and other places. You are seeing the movement towards democratic oppositions. You're seeing the beginning of slow beginning of elections. You are seeing it not only in North Africa, but further south through Black Africa itself. I think definitely there is a movement stirring. I think it's going to be one of the major stories to watch over the coming decade, and a lot of the world now that we've kind of taken for granted was off the democratic board and not part of that process. You are now seeing opposition students and opposition forces beginning to hear themselves heard, and I think this is going to be a tumult. Kuwait will be very interesting to watch here. Whether out of Kuwait they could possibly put it back Humpty Dumpty the way it once was, and I doubt that very much. But I also think that's a process that is taking place slowly, very slowly, and timorously in other parts of the Arab world itself. I wouldn't rule it out altogether.
Patrick?
A couple of years ago, we had a question roughly on the same scale of difficulty as the ones we're getting. Why is the world as it is? The question was... and the one we couldn't answer a couple of years ago is Elvis really dead? On democracy. Democracy is the exception. Democracy, as we understand it, is the exception rather than the norm in this world. I cover, as Peter pointed out, all of Asia, and there is not really in all of the Far East a country that we would recognize as democracy by Canadian standards. Even if you include Japan, the politics are very different in most countries. And sad though it is, for believers in democracy, democracy is the exception rather than the norm in the world right now.
The follow-up question was, what are the implications for the peace process of the absence of democracy at this time?
Is Elvis really dead?
Joe will take a run at that, if you want.
Well, the implications are that any regime that does make a deal with Israel might find itself overthrown, that the regimes that, since there are no democratic regimes with firm democratic mandates, the regimes that are in power feel constrained by whatever, constrained from making, look at what happened to, they remember what happened to Sadat after the Camp David agreements. So they have to be careful. And that is a real constraint. If there were solid democracies with solid popular mandates, it might be different.
I want to move it on, but just a reminder, if we can keep the questions pointed and the answers just as so. And Patrick wasn't kidding when we said a couple of years ago, after a particularly hard night like this, that he was asked in Halifax whether or not Elvis was dead. And like every other question that's asked of Patrick, he was able to answer it because he'd actually been at Graceland for the memorial service. Microphone number 1.
For a slight change of pace, rather than question you further about the coverage of recent events, I'd like to ask a little bit more about your work as foreign correspondents, in particular as Canadian journalists. Therefore, I guess my question is directed to any or all of the panel. In the various countries in which you've worked, what is the reaction you find of the people of those countries to you as Canadian journalists? Do you find you're more or less warmly welcomed than other foreign journalists?
I'm going to ask Martin Seemungle to start us off on this. Martin, why don't you try to deal with that, the impact of being Canadian trying to cover these stories?
Well, a lot of it depends on which country you're in. I can start by saying when I was in the Persian Gulf with the Canadian ships, I was greeted very well as a Canadian. But that's unusual. In Africa, for example, in places like Ethiopia or Sudan, where Canadians are thought of as people who come in when the going gets tough and will help out, you get a lot of support. Doors open up to you. For example, if I were to go to a story in a place like Ethiopia and there were an American crew there, chances are I'd get the interview before the American crew, simply because they look at Canada as someone who kind of stands back and will help people out, help the underdog, that sort of thing, give aid when it's necessary. Whereas they see the U.S. as a country that definitely will take a very strong stand with a big foot at times. In a country like India, it's strange. For some reason, there's a bit of a vacuum in that part of the world. When you go through India, I spend most of my time trying to say, no, I'm not the BBC, no, I'm not CBS, I'm CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So it does depend on the country you go in, and depending on that country, some countries treat you well, others, just don't even know who you are. It really depends. Not everyone watches CBC in the villages in India. That's the problem.
Don Murray.
It's been a surprise to me in the Soviet Union, and particularly in the Baltics. The first few times I was there, and in the Ukraine, how there Canada is clearly an important player because of exile populations and immigrant populations in Canada. Also, and I'm particularly in the Ukraine because of Radio Canada International. There is a definite impact, and it's been, I think, recognized, if you will, in Canada that with different delegations going to these areas, and so it's considered to be very important by these people, the stories that we do, and the fact that there is an echo in the West. I should also say, though, in relation to American crews, that almost everywhere I've been in the world, I announce that I'm from the CBC, and people's eyes somehow glaze over at the second C, and they all hear CBS. It happened most recently in Georgia when we were trying to get, and finally did get an interview with Mr. Gamsakordia, and he was delighted to be talking to CBS, and when I thought for a minute, I'll just let him go along with that idea. And then I did say, no, in fact, sir, CBC, and his face literally did drop a bit, but he did do the interview, so.
All right, you've hit on a question that many of the correspondents want to go on. Paul, first.
I was just going to say how quickly things have changed in the Middle East now. If you're not from CNN, you're nobody.
Well, I know if you work for NBC, because I have, if you would, for instance, travel to certain countries, you could get a foreign minister within 24 hours. CBC would probably take often 24 weeks. You basically have to work a lot harder to rattle the doors of government in a lot of these countries. But if you will forgive me, I will bring it back to recent events. Now, I'll go into my bitter rant once again, that here we were as a country, the fourth largest military contributor from the West to go into the coalition in the Gulf. And my point is that We can do very well, the CBC, very often, when we're out there working our own turf, away from the mobs, away from the crowds, away from news mobs I'm talking about, which are the worst mobs of all. But when the big stories break, the Reykjaviks, the summits, when the wars break out, we very often get trampled underneath. And I would like to remind people that all the debating Canada did about our contribution to the Gulf, all the contribution we did put into the Gulf, when it came time for the Saudi Arabians to drop their list of correspondents, Canada was given 1 place out of 126, Monte Carlo was given 4, Portugal was given 3, and Austria, which sent nothing, was given, I think, about 4. So there is a tendency, I'm afraid, for us very often to be pushed to the back at the big international gatherings, and this is something that Canadian correspondents, all of us, are going to have to develop some very tough elbow pads in the coming year, because the fighting out there is getting really severe in the media.
Joe?
Over the years, wherever I've gone, I've always met people who said, I have a cousin in Toronto, I have a cousin in Vancouver, I have a cousin. I'll tell you, this country, and they want me, this country is made up of a lot of cousins. And they always want me to say hi to their cousins. So hi there, cousins.
I'd like to take you back to the Middle East. And before I get to my question, a very short background. 2 years ago, Syria was an alien nation, the haven of terrorists. It had a clear stated desire to annex Lebanon. Everyone hated them. A war came, they became an overnight ally. They have annexed most of Lebanon. 2 years ago, Iraq was a hero. They were fighting Iran, the villains. There's a war, they're the enemy. 2 years ago, they were eradicating the Kurds. Comes the war, comes the peace. Our side, if it doesn't provoke, it certainly encourages the Kurds to rise up and move out. We now see an extermination of immense proportion. With that as your background, members of the panel, tell me what you predict for the element of trust that is asked of the participants of a peace process in the Middle East.
Well, that's certainly a loaded one, and I mean, I think we will hold our panelists to not getting into a guessing game about the future. But I know that Paul Workman, as our Middle East correspondent, would like to at least in some manner
Thanks, Peter.
tackle some of the things you've brought forward, especially in the light of the process that's underway now.
Well, I think you're quite right. The trust is going to be the most important factor in any peace process in the Middle East, and until they can find a matter of trust between the parties, nothing is going to happen. Maybe the fact that Syria's position has now been elevated will make it easier for the Americans to push the Israelis and the Syrians into some sort of talks, because if the Israelis and the Syrians don't begin, or if it doesn't begin there, I don't think anything is going to happen. As a prognosis, let me say that I think Syria should be watched closely, because I think that's where a breakthrough may come, if it comes anywhere. Before I left Israel, one of the senior ministers was saying that there were no conditions anymore for talking to the Syrians, which led me to believe that the Israelis would be perhaps willing to open up and speak to the Syrians, and maybe move towards some sort of peace with them as a beginning for a larger peace in the Middle East.
Okay. I want to ask Joe to come in on this, too, as someone who's spent more than a little bit of time trying to cover the Middle East story over the years, watching what's unfolding now. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I won't try to prognosticate either, but let's look in the past and what has been achieved. Who would have thought 3 years before Sadat went to Jerusalem that there would be the Sinai agreements? Who would have thought that 3 years ago that the Soviet Union would walk out of Eastern Europe? There has been change in this world, and there can be change in situations which appear absolutely impossible. So, yes, trust will be difficult, but trust there must be found, and that's what statesmanship is all about.
From Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto, the CBC Foreign Correspondents Forum 1991.
Microphone number one.
Right. The plight of the Kurds, we don't have to go into that. It is like a genocide. Could it be that the plight of the Kurds is partially attributable to the fact that there was so little coverage by the media, and there's one who watches CBC quite a bit, the shallowness of their covering of the Near East in essence, and the gentlemen, I believe, are quite capable of, and the lady, quite capable of in-depth research, yet it doesn't seem to manifest itself relative to the Middle East.
Okay. None of us sit before you and try to claim that we have covered all the peoples of the world and given their background at times when perhaps we should. This is, an incredibly complex world we live in. It is an incredibly, especially these past few months, stories, as you've heard already, a number of the correspondents mentioning to you, suddenly coming up, towns, cities, peoples who, quite frankly, many of us have never even heard of before, are suddenly at the forefront of the news. It is our challenge to try to put these stories in a nightly way, in some context, to better explain them. I think it's fair to say, on many things, many nights, over the years, we have failed in doing that. We constantly try our best to get better at doing this. This particular story has been an extremely difficult one over this past year. I'm not sure exactly how to go about trying to answer your specific point. I think while we've already conceded the journalists who were at the front about the terrible nature in which the media was dealt with in this war, and those of us at the back, how we tried to set things in context and analyze issues, we have seen our shortcomings. We hope that we can do better in the future, and we have taken into account everything you've said.
I certainly hope so, because I am positive that you all can do a fairer, better job.
Microphone number two.
Okay, my question is for the future. It is for Paul Workman. Will the CBC give coverage in your broadcasts to the growing number of Jews, like myself, who stand as Jews in opposition to the policies of the Israeli government and its current practices, and in alliance with our Palestinian sisters and brothers in working for justice in the Middle East?
Your question suggests that we haven't been giving coverage and time to those Jews who would be in favor of giving up land for peace. I think we certainly try to be as fair and generous to all of the political opinions in Israel. Certainly, it's as you well realize, it's a very delicate issue when you touch it, no matter when you touch it. And so I think we'll quite consistently talk to all sides on the issue, as we have in the past. Just very quickly, I spoke to a political scientist in Israel before I left, who I think probably is on the left, who was saying that Israel has never bent or moved before as a result of outside pressure, and that the only way there may be some movement in whatever direction will be when the Israelis themselves and Jews in the diaspora actually start to put more pressure on the Israeli government, whatever government it is. So, if that's the answer, if that's an adequate answer to your question, yeah. I think it's wise counsel.
Yeah. All right, Anna Maria wanted to respond after you.
I think I agree with what Paul has said, that in fact we do seek out Jews in Israel who have those views and who do not agree with the position of the Israeli government, and I think that view has come across. Just as on the Palestinian side, not everyone has a hardline view on that side as well, and we have to continue to show all of that, but I think we have been doing that. In relation to what I said earlier, the Israeli government sees really a two-track negotiating system where it wants to talk to Arab countries and it will not talk to the PLO. It says it will talk to other Palestinians, and I think that obviously there are severe problems there in getting to a position where they can start to sit down and negotiate. However, when they indicate a willingness to start on one track and to begin, I think that is at least a start in what will be a long and difficult process.
Microphone number two.
During the last few months, I've had occasion to travel to Europe and the Third World during the war and what you innocuously called its aftermath. I've had occasion to compare notes, and I find that the war that was covered in the Third World and elsewhere was a totally different war from what we saw in the media here, coming back to a flurry of yellow ribbons in New York. Now, my question is, how far do you think the CBC is guilty, like Western media generally, in representing the war as a media event, like a sanitized, desensitized kind of a war, a video game sort of a representation of the war, rather than representing the magnitude of opposition to the war, resistance to the war, and the real suffering and the havoc that was created as a result of it?
All right. I think all of us would be fascinated to have been in the position that you've been and able to see it both ways, how our country reported this story and how it was reported in any number of third world countries. I'm going to ask Brian Stewart to respond as well to this question. I think you've got to appreciate, because I've certainly seen it in the mail that we received through our war coverage, that there was a great deal of feeling on both sides of this issue. Some people have suggested, even somebody who I believe has just been appointed to the board of directors of the CBC, that we were Radio Iraq, while others, and believe me, there were other people who felt that way as well, and there were others who felt that we took a pro-Pentagon line. So believe me, I've seen both kind of criticisms, and when you look at them side by side, you have to assume that somewhere you were doing something right to get that kind of division of opinion about our coverage. But Brian, why don't you address this point as well, somebody who was over there and spent a good deal of his time working on this story?
Well, I think, as you can judge by our comments, everybody who had anything to do with the coverage of the war is still to somewhat tormented about it. I don't go along with all the statements here about a lousy job the media did all the way down the line. As a matter of fact, I think some of the media did a quite good job. I think a lot of it's been overlooked. I would caution against an assumption that somehow good reporting of war is necessarily anti-war reporting. There has been a growing sense here that, unless somehow the coverage is skewered to depict the war as grotesquely evil or wrong or something, that must mean you're in league with one, the war faction or something. To give a balanced reporting, I have had a chance as I came back from the war to watch minutely day after day, for instance, the CBC coverage, and I was quite impressed, for instance, how many times Peter Mansbridge pointed out the degree of misinformation that was likely to be spread out. Constantly the CBC were warning people that in wartime, truth is guarded by a bodyguard of lies. Our point that we would likely be the subject of misinformation was made time after time after time. But coming back to the war, was it wrong to also report that elements of the war were very successful, that certain generals performed quite remarkably well in logistics and other parts of the war? I think that somehow the assumption that I gather with some people that all our coverage should have been somehow negative, that everything was an expose of a mess or a fiasco in the war, that we didn't constantly hammer home on that, we were somehow letting down war coverage. There was a lot of interesting war coverage that in fact did go on, that was very often, I admit, overwhelmed by the fact that we were prisoners of a system that briefed us to death. We shouldn't have been surprised by this, by the way. We were predicting years before the war that when the next big war came along, we would all be put in velvet pools and become prisoners of that system. Our biggest problem is we have to come to terms with what the media management can now do to break that system if it has ever tried again, and I think it will be if there is another war again, and I think the military will win the next time around too.
Microphone number 1.
Yes, I'm a journalism student from Lambton College, and I'd like to know how you keep your objective as reporters out in the field. Like you're at a refugees camp and terrible things are going on around you. How do you keep that from getting into the story?
There are any number of our correspondents who could handle that question. Claude, do you want to try that one?
Well, happily, in a lot of these cases, and I think the refugee camp is one example. A recent visit that I made to Albania is another example. Very often, one doesn't have to worry too much about objectivity, because what we are really doing is observing, and we're showing you those pictures, and we're talking to the people and showing you images that you perhaps have never seen before. One doesn't necessarily have to make political judgments or value judgments. Often our job is really to show you those pictures and to let you draw your own conclusions. So in that sense, it's often a very easy process.
Yeah, but in some cases it'd be images you haven't even seen yourself.
That's true. And there's a certain amount of selectivity as well in the pictures that we show. But I don't think that we can be faulted in most of these stories for being overly selective. I think, for example, in Albania, as one example again, we literally turned our cameras on and didn't turn it off for a week. We'd never been there before. We saw things, we saw depths of poverty that we'd never seen before. And I don't think that we really spent a lot of time worrying about objectivity because we were simply showing a country that the West did not know, had not seen before, and it was not an ethically painful process.
Thank you.
I have a question about danger to you and your jobs. Just how close to the bang bang do you really get? That was Brian Stewart's phrase.
Brian and then Patrick.
Over the year, it varies from place to place. Sometimes much too close altogether. Other times not really. It varies immensely from place to place. I would say, oddly enough, I've been in 7 war zones, but it's not the shooting that scares me the most. Everybody fears a certain thing. Some people have terrors of car bombs. Some people fear snipers. Others fear mines. I always have this perpetual terror of being kidnapped. I probably even get it walking down Yonge Street in Toronto, but that is my biggest fear, is I'm going to end up chained to a radiator in some place for a few years.
Patrick?
Ideally close enough to see and to show you, and far enough away not to get shot. Sometimes one makes mistakes, but year after year, most of us are still here, and the most serious war injury I suffered in the recent conflict was to be attacked by a potted plant on the streets of Amman by an irate Palestinian lady. And there are journalists killed in the course of their duties, and that's part of the risk of attending these events, but mercifully few, because one tries to be careful.
Joe?
Most of the time when it's really dangerous, you don't have time to think about it. The thing I feel like he has is a little different. And what I don't like, I really don't like, is going up to a roadblock somewhere in Lebanon, let's say, and or in Cambodia, and having some young kid point a gun at your belly, and you wonder, does he really know how the thing works? I don't think. Really, if you go somewhere, whether, let's say, in places where you're under artillery fire, after a while it just becomes so much noise. It just, you don't think. First of all, as journalists, we are trained as observers. We start out at the police station, and we see people coming in, people are murdered, people are arrested for theft, all sorts of things happen to them. We just watch. Nothing happens to us. We go and cover politics. We go to City Hall. All sorts of people are up, all sorts of people are down, all sorts of casualties in the political battle. We just sit there. And so I remember going first when I went to war, and the artillery was coming up, down all over the place. Hey, it didn't affect me. I was just covering the story. The first time that I realized that I actually might be in danger, I was in a plane over Laos. And this stuff was coming up from the ground. And I suddenly realized, my God, they're shooting at me. But, hey, if they miss you, it's okay.
One of the great things about being the anchor, the biggest problem I have is, or used to have, when the Friendly Giant used to share our studio, was fearing that Rusty or Jerome might jump off the wall. Microphone number 2.
This is somewhat related to the previous question. I'd like to open it to any member of the panel who has has been faced with a life-threatening situation. At what point do you draw the line between getting this story and maintaining your own personal safety?
Well, let Terry start this.
You draw the line when you're going to die if you go after the story. And terror usually takes care of making these decisions for you. It's actually not a complex decision. If you can hear it going through the leaves in the trees above your head, you hit the dirt and you stay there, and you don't even think about, perhaps if I just did my hair nicely and poked my head up a little bit, I could do a little on-camera shtick and get it shot off. You don't make decisions like that. That part of it is easy. But I will say just two other things on this subject. Terry Anderson, Farzad Bazoft, those people typify, those people explain, offer an answer to many of the questions that have been raised here tonight about why we do a lousy job covering repressive regimes where there are all kinds of human rights abuses in all kinds of awful places in the world. Farzad Bazoft was hanged by Saddam Hussein for attempting to report on what was going on in Iraq, and Terry Anderson is still kidnapped in Lebanon.
Microphone number 2.
A brief question directed to Patrick Brown, if I could. It's been a few years now since the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was generally run or started by students. And I was wondering if this democracy movement is still alive now, or is it being suppressed by the Chinese government? Is it in effect right now? Are they still working at it?
It's very much alive in people's minds. It is very much not in evidence on the streets or on the bulletin boards of the universities, where these things tend to start to creep out with little posters and so on. People do not feel that now is the time to protest in China. And the fact that hundreds of them and possibly more were shot in 1989 has a large bearing on their decision not to protest right now. But the aims and ideals of 1989, that is to say, an end to official corruption and that the government should stop treating its people like children and give them responsibility and tell them the truth, those aims are very much alive in the minds of a large proportion of the 1.3 billion Chinese.
Microphone number 1.
Hi, I'm a Ryerson journalism student, and I have a question for Anna Maria Tremonti. Seeing that you're the only female on the panel, I was wondering if you encountered difficulties or obstacles working as a female foreign correspondent in countries that may treat women differently than in Canada.
There are a lot of women actually out there. I have not personally run across any difficulties related to the fact that I'm a woman. I have not, however, worked in the Arab world, and I have heard that there have been some difficulties there. But if you go into almost any foreign country now to cover something, you will run into a growing number of women. And that's just the way it is, and I think it's generally accepted. I think I should point out, too, that I may be the only woman up here tonight, but during our war coverage, we did have a number of other women who were there for the CBC, who were behind the scenes. We had a number of producers. There are a number of women who work as producers for the CBC who work with the people up here on a regular basis. And so I can't say that I personally have had a problem. Again, it's something that evolves. When I first started in this business, there were never any women around. That has changed, and you deal with any problem as a journalist, not as a woman who is a journalist.
Microphone number 1.
There were a couple of comments this evening that I hope don't necessarily reflect the philosophy. Joe Schlesinger mentioned quite clearly that the world is a big place and somewhat dangerous. And Terry Malusky mentioned Terry Anderson. And I'm wondering if the coverage is based on the ease and safety of access into a country. Nobody wants to get killed. It's a reasonable request. Doesn't it somewhat follow that there's protection from the type of moral outrage for human rights abuses and other things by closing your borders, by running in a dictatorship? So the perspective that one might get because of the focus on the nations where one can actually go and film negative things is out of proportion. And as a second thing to that, it was said, and I was stuck behind a lineup and I don't know quite who said it, I'm not sure how much good it does to discuss the roots of the problem. It reminds me of the joke about the 5 blind men trying to tell what an elephant was by feeling the different parts. Isn't there a danger of seeing one little piece and seeing one little piece, and actually, in seeing that one little piece without going to the roots, creating a more ignorant population with only a little piece of the picture, and yet willing to put forth an opinion on what they consider, falsely or not, the big picture?
All right. A very strong question to end this forum on tonight. I'm going to ask a number of our correspondents to answer it. I do think, in fairness, though, to put the quote in that you referred to put it in some context, I think Paul was suggesting that you can't do that every time you cover a story that relates to where there is a history to the issue at hand. But let me ask 4 of our correspondents who spent a good part of their lives going through borders and into countries where, believe me, life isn't that easy for not only the people who live in it, but correspondents covering the stories. Brian, Don, Joe, and Patrick. Brian?
Well, I think as we've talked about here before, people take great risks to get in there. I think you do have a certain point that some countries, and you can name any of them, that have opened their borders to the media. You could pick any number. El Salvador is one, allows the media in, perhaps gets a sharper focus on its degree of oppression or evil that might be going on there than Albania, that kept the media out altogether for 30-odd years. There is that element that is very disturbing. I think we're acutely aware of that, and I think increasingly now we are more anxious to break through countries, through the borders that are closed to us, and we are more anxious to put that into perspective. I think 15, 20 years ago, we probably didn't put it in enough perspective.
I'd just like to say that I think that there's perhaps a premise that's unstated in your question, that somehow the people in these countries somehow are not aware or not willing to let's say they're not aware and perhaps ignorant of the true extent of repression. I think that whether you look at, well, if you look at particularly the Soviet Union, if repression in and of itself can only last for a certain period of time in many countries, in almost any country, the collapse of what was stated to be 15 years ago almost a permanent and aging totalitarian system, I think bears that out. And what also has happened, and as that system has collapsed, it is surprising the amount of information that circulated, not officially, but unofficially, in that country itself, and was fed by even the most minor or smallest pieces of information coming from the outside. People are extremely knowledgeable in the Soviet Union about abuses, and so I think that perhaps the unstated premise that somehow the people in these countries are living in ignorance and therefore don't know what's going on and aren't in effect working, even if by inertia, to change things is wrong.
Joe?
Well, the countries that Brian mentioned, Salvador, that they let the press in, and Albania, which didn't. The difference, of course, is Salvador didn't let the press in because they liked the press, they liked the truth. They let the press in is because they needed American money, and the Americans insisted that they let press in. Albania was cut off from the world and didn't give a damn or didn't get any money from the West. Once they did, once all these Eastern European countries did, they started letting the press in, they started letting the radio broadcasts of Radio Free Europe in, and of course in the end, that helped topple those regimes. As for context, as for background, I love nothing more than reading history. If I had my druthers, I'd probably sit there reading history all my life. However, I don't think I'd be a good historian. I need my dose of adrenaline. I want to see history being made. I want to see history now. And that's what this job has allowed me to do. But that doesn't, I have to read up on history to know the context and keep the context in mind. But in 2 minutes and 10 seconds, I can't go into the history of whatever country we're talking about. And I just have to keep it in mind. I have to try not to violate the spirit of that history. And that's what we try to do.
Patrick?
I can't begin to count the number of times I've been arrested, stopped, detained, shot at, mostly not voluntarily, in Romania before the revolution, in Romania during the revolution. We do go to these places as much as we can, and we do, in our little miniature painter's canvas of 2 minutes and 10 seconds, do our best to put the things in the context. And if it is perhaps the leg of the elephant tonight, you might get the trunk tomorrow and perhaps the tail on Monday. We're miniature painters.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a remarkable evening, and I want to thank you all for your participation. I think if there's one thing that all of us in this room can agree on, those of us who report the news and those of you who watch it, is that there is a relationship between us that is based on trust. That relationship is often challenged. It has been here tonight. I hope that the relationship is stronger because of it all. Once again, thanks very much.